People in this country don't know what the real cost of money in politics is, and because of that, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people who have died from opioid overdoses would be alive today. Because the drug distributors and manufacturers weren't being held accountable for the amount of drugs that they were producing and distributing to the American public. It's disheartening to be a part of a window or view into an industry that, because they're so powerful, have so much money, that they can pay $100 million for politicians, campaigns, and a lobbying group to get a law changed that basically takes the teeth out of the DEA's enforcement effectiveness by allowing these companies to get a pass. If they get caught, they basically get an opportunity to fix their mistake before they're held accountable for it. When you see how big money in politics affects drug manufacturers and never holds them accountable, but enhances their ability to make more money off pushing these drugs. So there's an example of how money in politics affects change to benefit a small minority of business that then uses their power and influence to poison a society with opioid drugs.
I like the public finance program because it takes democracy back to the people. It's about going to the people in your district, exciting them, hopefully, getting them to want to support you, and that's very different than playing to a crowd of a few individuals with a bunch of money.
Had it not been for public financing, I wouldn't have been able to run. I don't have a great deal of disposable income, and the CEP opened up an avenue for me as a first-time candidate that would have been closed to me. It was a game changer. Public financing removes that special power that comes from money, that money inherently gives people. For our democracy truly to work, we have to remove that kind of influence because it can be abused very, very easily, and it can make people vote a certain way.
I spent about 2 weeks raising money. That's it. The whole rest of my time was focused on every single individual voter that I met with, and I didn't have to allocate my time calling people for money or setting up particular events that were focused on who had the capacity to write me big checks.
We do have two choices. We have what we see in Washington, where members are elected and then they're constantly in a battle to raise money from rich people and special interests. Or you've got a system like what we have here in Connecticut, where a poor kid like me, the daughter of an Irish immigrant, and yet I was able to run for the state legislature, and I've served there now for 10 years, and that is directly because of public financing. It's changed who runs for office. It's changed how we serve in office.
We need to move to a 21st century model that empowers small donors and fix this broken link between public officials and their constituents. And there have been dozens of small donor incentive programs that have sprung up across the country. Connecticut is one where you have matching funds, small dollar incentives. There are others in Maine and Arizona. And Seattle's the most innovative model with this democracy dollars, where everyone gets some of their money back from government to be a small donor in politics.
A candidate running for a state representative would go out and collect small dollar donations in amounts from $5 to $250 for at least $5,100. 150 of those small dollar donations would have to be from their constituents who live within their district. A grant would be released to them for $28,150 in addition to the $5,100 in qualifying contributions. 80% of the candidates participated in the program, and about 80% of our sitting legislators have received clean election grants.
Some people complain about the idea of using taxpayer dollars or even public funds that come from some other source to fund elections. Why should we fund it? People should raise the money themselves. Well, I think you have to take a look at how politics works. The people who fund the elections own the elections. Do you want elections owned by billionaires and corporations, or do you want them owned by all of us? And if we want to own them, we don't want somebody else to own our representatives, then we got to be willing to pay for it. And when you actually look at the costs of the public funding campaigns that are in existence in Connecticut, for example, it's a tiny fraction.
This year, with the statewide added in, it was about $26 million for all of election grants. That amount equals about 0.1% of our budget, which is a relatively small price to pay for a functioning democracy.
If you don't pay for it, somebody else is going to pay for it. And the day after the election, that's the person to whom the candidate is going to be beholden, not the voter. To me, what's really impressive about the public funding of campaigns is it generates an opposition candidate for incumbents in 70–80% of the districts. And it makes it possible for all kinds of ordinary people, middle-class Americans, to run for office because they don't have to raise a heck of a lot of money.
I think the biggest argument I get from my colleagues is that your public financing system has made us have even representation with the Republicans. Public financing definitely makes it easier for somebody to be an incumbent, and so that's a reason why incumbents might not support the system.
I'm completely sympathetic to people who say global warming is critical, we must do something about it. I'm sympathetic to people who say we got to do something about the immigration problem. I mean, there's one problem after another. You can tick off the problems, and they're unresolved. And the reason they're unresolved is the political system is broken. Fixing the political system is the gateway issue. It is the gate through which we have to pass if you want to tackle the other issues.
And here is where Americans agree. Political corruption is the #1 problem facing our country. And around this agreement, we're going to find that people across the political spectrum who have not worked together, who don't agree on how to fix things like health care and climate, will agree in how we're going to deal with corruption.
But just to be clear, this system that we have in Connecticut is under threat. The dark money is really a scary thing, and it's what's undermining this great system that I'm so proud of here. And it's one of the arguments that my colleagues use as to why we need to change our public financing system in Connecticut. And it's hard for me to argue with them on this point because this dark money can come from anywhere. 2 years ago, there were a lot of special interests that were trying to flip the Connecticut State Senate. And I remember when I signed that paperwork saying I was going to abide by those spending limits, I was a little nervous because I knew I was one of the targets. And so thinking about agreeing to only spend X amount of dollars on my campaign, knowing that my opponent, he was going to have all this outside money and independent expenditures made on his behalf, was a pretty scary prospect.
So the first thing that we need to do is pass robust disclosure laws so that if anyone's spending money to influence the election, they are registering and reporting so voters know who is trying to buy our elections. But secondly, what we need is an amendment to the US Constitution so that we, the people, can regulate money in our political process. Money is not speech and corporations are not people. And a constitutional amendment is the only way to get there. New Hampshire just became the 20th state calling on Congress to amend the Constitution. We need other states to do that.
Significant change in our country always comes from the people. It doesn't come from the politicians. The politicians are always the last to come around to much needed reforms and change. We see hope at the state and local level. Like many movements we've seen in U.S. history that have been successful for civil rights, for women's suffrage, for decriminalization of marijuana, the fight begins in the states. You win enough state and local victories, you build a movement, you apply the pressure on the Congress and on Washington, D.C., and you get to national change.
One of the things that we're doing is we're urging our members to call their elected officials and advocate for these solutions. Whether we go meet a candidate and ask them in person,
whether it's gathering some signatures, making some calls to voters, knocking on a few doors.
There's a whole menu of different activities that you can do.
No matter how busy you are, you can find 30 seconds or 30 minutes or 30 hours to contribute to unrigging the system.
There's absolutely no guarantee that democracy will work right. You have to fight for it. Otherwise, it'll slip right through your fingers. And it means we've got to get off our couches. We've got to go out there and fight for the democracy that is precious to all of us. Otherwise, it'll evaporate or other people will grab the power, keep themselves in power, and hold ordinary people down or ignore them.